I realized I had been erased from my own family the moment my daughter-in-law smiled at me and said, "You can sit over there, Margaret." My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 68 years old, and I spent 40 years building a home that no longer feels like mine, a place where every corner once held laughter, birthday candles, and Sunday dinners that stretched for hours. Yet on that warm May afternoon, as sunlight poured through the tall windows of the dining room I paid for, I found myself standing alone with a paper plate in my hand while strangers sat in my seat. People who didn't even know the stories behind the photographs, lining the walls. And the worst part wasn't the chair or the table, or even the fact that my son Daniel avoided my eyes. It was the quiet certainty settling in my chest that this had not happened overnight, that I had been slowly pushed out, step by step, smile by smile, until there was nothing left of my place in this family but obligation and polite distance. And as I stood there pretending not to notice, pretending that being asked to sit at a folding table near the patio door was somehow reasonable in my own house, I couldn't stop replaying the years that led to this moment. The day Daniel brought his wife Chloe home for the first time, how I welcomed her with open arms, how I told everyone she was the daughter I never had, how I trusted her with keys, with recipes, with traditions that had been passed down from my own mother, never imagining that one day those same traditions would be used as a way to edge me out, to rewrite the story of this family without me in it. And even then, as laughter echoed from the dining room, and someone else poured wine into my crystal glasses, I told myself to be patient, to be understanding, because that's what mothers do. We adjust, we make space, we sacrifice. But what I didn't realize, what I refused to see until it was too late, was that I wasn't being asked to make space, I was being replaced, and that realization didn't come with shouting or confrontation. It came quietly, in the form of a seating arrangement, a soft voice, a gentle smile, and a sentence that sounded harmless to everyone else but felt like a door closing to me. And as I finally sat down at that small table by the door, listening to the clinking of silverware that used to be set for me, I understood something with a clarity that made my hands tremble. If I didn't take back control of my life, of my home, of my own story, I would disappear completely, not in a dramatic way, not with anger or tears, but in the most painful way possible, by being forgotten while I was still standing right there in the room. By the time the guests had settled into the living room, I had already begun to notice the small details that no one else seemed to catch, the kind of details a woman only learns to see after decades of running a household and watching people closely. My daughter-in-law, Melissa, was smiling as she handed out glasses of sparkling cider, her voice sweet and warm, but her eyes never quite met mine. Instead, she moved around me as if I were part of the furniture, something present but no longer important. I told myself not to read too much into it, that perhaps I was simply tired, but then I noticed something else. The seat at the head of the dining table, the one I had sat in for over 30 years, had been quietly taken. My son, Daniel, was sitting there now, laughing a little louder than usual, while Melissa placed her hand gently on his shoulder as if to anchor him in that position. No one said anything. No one asked me where I would like to sit. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, holding a serving dish that suddenly felt heavier than it was, before I quietly took a seat near the corner. It was a small thing, I told myself again, just a chair, just a moment, but something inside me shifted. Throughout dinner, conversations flowed around me like a current I could not quite step into. Plans were being discussed, decisions about the house, about future renovations, even about the upcoming holidays, all spoken as if they had already been agreed upon. I listened carefully, waiting for a pause, for someone to include me, but that pause never came. Melissa spoke with confidence, mentioning budgets and timelines, her tone calm and assured, and Daniel nodded along, occasionally adding a comment, never once glancing in my direction for approval or even acknowledgement. I felt a quiet pressure building in my chest, not anger, not yet, but a deep, unsettling realization that something had been decided without me. When dessert was served, Melissa brought out a neatly printed folder and placed it on the coffee table, announcing it as a little update for the family. Her voice was cheerful, almost rehearsed. One by one, she handed out copies, smiling as everyone flipped through the pages. When she finally reached me, she hesitated for just a fraction of a second before placing the folder in my hands. I opened it slowly, my fingers steady even as my thoughts began to race. It was a proposal, detailed and organized, outlining changes to the ownership structure of the house, the very house I had paid off with my late husband, the place where every memory of our life together still lived in the walls. My name was still there, but smaller now, secondary, almost like an afterthought. I lifted my eyes and looked at Daniel, waiting for him to explain, to say something that would make sense of what I was seeing, but he only gave me a tight smile, the kind people give when they hope you will not ask questions. And in that moment, I understood that this was not a discussion they were inviting me into. It was a decision they expected me to accept. I did not speak right away because I had learned long ago that silence can reveal more than any question ever could. And so I let the room continue as if nothing had shifted, as if the paper in my hands did not quietly rewrite the story of my own home. I turned another page slowly, my eyes scanning every line, every carefully chosen word, noticing how everything was framed as practical, efficient, even generous, yet nowhere did it mention when this had been discussed with me. Melissa began explaining the document as though she were presenting a thoughtful gift, her tone calm and measured, pointing out how this new arrangement would simplify things and protect the family in the long run. I could hear the approval in the small nods around the room, the soft murmurs of agreement, and it became clear that this was not new information to them. I was the only one seeing it for the first time. That realization settled heavily on my shoulders, but I kept my posture straight, my expression neutral, because I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me unsettled. I asked one simple question, my voice steady, asking when exactly this plan had been put together. There was a brief pause, just a second too long to be natural, before Daniel answered, saying they had been talking about it for a while. He avoided my eyes as he spoke, and that told me everything I needed to know. For a while meant weeks, maybe months, conversations happening in corners of this very house, while I was cooking meals, folding laundry, believing I was still at the center of my own family. I nodded slowly, as if his answer made sense, and lowered my gaze back to the paper. But inside, something far deeper than hurt began to take shape. It was clarity. I noticed how the document suggested that certain financial responsibilities would now shift to them, while decision-making authority would also naturally transition, as Melissa phrased it, into their hands. It sounded balanced on the surface, but I knew better. I had managed every bill, every repair, every unexpected expense for decades. I knew exactly what it cost to keep this house standing, and I also knew how quickly control could slip away once it was handed over, even in small pieces. When I finally looked up again, I allowed myself a faint smile, the kind that reassures people you are not going to make things difficult. Melissa seemed to relax at that, her shoulders lowering just slightly, as if she had been bracing for resistance. Daniel leaned back in his chair, relieved, thinking perhaps that I would simply accept this as another step in life, another quiet transition. They both underestimated me, and I realized in that moment that they had not been paying attention for a very long time. I closed the folder gently and placed it on the table beside me, my movements unhurried, deliberate, and calm. I thanked Melissa for putting so much effort into the document, my voice even, almost warm, and I told them I would need some time to review everything carefully before making any decisions. It was a reasonable request, one that no one in that room could refuse without revealing too much. Melissa nodded quickly, agreeing that of course I should take my time, while Daniel gave a small laugh, saying there was no rush, though his tone carried a hint of something else, something impatient beneath the surface. I sat there quietly as the conversation moved on again, but this time, I was no longer listening as a participant. I was observing, measuring, and remembering every detail, because for the first time that evening, I was no longer reacting to what they had done. I was beginning to think about what I would do next. By the next morning, I had already made 3 quiet phone calls before the sun even touched the edge of the maple trees outside my kitchen window. And for the first time in months, I felt something I had almost forgotten, a sense of control returning to my own life. Not loud or dramatic, but steady and deliberate like the ticking of the old clock your father used to wind every Sunday afternoon. And as I sat there with my coffee growing cold in my hands, I realized that everything they had done, every whisper, every exclusion, every carefully staged moment to make me feel small, had been built on one dangerous assumption, that I would remain silent forever, that I would keep choosing peace over truth, and they were wrong, deeply wrong, because I had not spent over 40 years building a home, raising a son, and holding a family together just to be erased from it like I was some temporary guest. And so when Daniel finally came downstairs that morning, still avoiding my eyes the way he had been for weeks, I did not raise my voice, I did not accuse, I simply asked him to sit, and there was something in my tone that made him listen, something calm and unshakable, and I watched his face carefully as I placed the folder on the table between us, not opening it yet, just letting it exist there, heavy with everything he had chosen not to see, and I told him, slowly and clearly, that I had reviewed every document tied to the house, every transfer, every signature, every date, and that I now understood exactly when things had begun to change, and I saw it then, that flicker of unease in his eyes, the first crack in the confidence that had been handed to him, because for the first time, he realized I was no longer guessing. I knew, and I continued without giving him space to interrupt, explaining that the property he believed had quietly shifted into his and Melissa's control had never fully left my name, that the structure of ownership, something I had agreed to years ago under very different circumstances, had protections built into it, protections he had clearly never bothered to understand, and as I spoke, I kept my voice level, not cold, not angry, just precise, because this was not about emotion anymore. This was about facts, and facts do not need to shout to be heard. And when I finally opened the folder and turned it toward him, I did not point, I did not explain further. I simply let the documents speak for themselves, and the silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before, because it was no longer filled with assumptions or manipulation, it was filled with realization. And in that moment, sitting across from my own son, I understood something with absolute clarity. I had given them every chance to treat me with dignity, and they had chosen otherwise, and now, for the first time, the balance had shifted, not through revenge, not through anger, but through the simple, undeniable truth that I was still standing, still thinking, and no longer willing to be quietly moved aside. Daniel did not speak right away, and that silence told me more than any explanation he could have offered, because for the first time since all of this had begun, he was no longer standing on solid ground, and I could see him trying to piece together how much I knew, how far I had already gone without him realizing it. And when he finally looked up at me, there was something different in his expression, not anger, not even defensiveness, but uncertainty, the kind that comes when a person realizes they have trusted the wrong version of a story for far too long. And I let that moment sit between us, because I was not here to rush him toward comfort. I was here to let him face the truth at his own pace. And after what felt like a long minute, he asked me in a quiet voice why I had never said anything sooner. And I answered him honestly, telling him that I had been waiting for him to notice on his own, waiting for him to ask questions, waiting for him to remember who I was beyond the role they had slowly pushed me into. But waiting had only given them more time to rewrite everything. And I was no longer willing to disappear just to keep the peace. And as I spoke, I saw his shoulders shift, the weight of realization settling in, because deep down, he knew that I had never been careless, never been uninvolved, never been the kind of woman who would sign away her life without understanding the consequences. And yet he had allowed himself to believe exactly that. And then came the part one had prepared for, the part that would change everything moving forward. Because I calmly explained that I had already taken the necessary legal steps to ensure that no further decisions regarding the house or any related assets could be made without my direct approval, that the authority they thought they had secured was no longer valid in the way they believed, and that any attempt to act otherwise would be immediately challenged, not with anger, but with clarity and documentation. And this time, I did not soften my words, I did not cushion the reality for him. Because he needed to understand that this was not a conversation about feelings anymore. This was about responsibility and consequences. And when he asked if Melissa knew about this, I met his eyes and told him that she would soon enough, because I had no intention of keeping things hidden the way they had. Everything would be transparent from this point forward. And that transparency would be the very thing they had tried so hard to avoid. And as I stood up from the table, I noticed how different the room felt. The same walls, the same furniture, but the balance had shifted in a way that could not be undone. and before I walked away, I placed my hand gently on the back of his chair and told him something he would remember long after this conversation ended. That respect is not something you remove from a person when it becomes inconvenient, and once it is lost, it is not easily restored. And with that, I left him sitting there with the truth, knowing that this was only the beginning of what they would have to face, not because I wanted to punish them, but because I had finally decided that my place in this family would no longer be negotiated in silence. That evening, I did not raise my voice, and I did not confront anyone at the dinner table, because I understood something far more powerful than anger, which was timing. And as I sat there quietly, listening to the soft clinking of forks and the hollow laughter that now felt rehearsed, I realized that every single person in that room believed I had already been erased, that I was simply too old, too tired, and too dependent to notice what had been done behind my back, and that assumption, more than anything else, became my greatest advantage, because when people underestimate you, they stop guarding themselves, they speak freely, they leave doors open, and they make mistakes, and I began to notice those mistakes one by one, like pieces of a puzzle slowly revealing the full picture, because my daughter-in-law, Emily, was no longer careful around me. She no longer lowered her voice when speaking to my son about financial decisions. She no longer pretended to include me in conversations about the house. And just 2 days later, while standing in the hallway outside the study, I overheard something that confirmed my deepest suspicion. She was on the phone, her tone sharp and impatient, saying that everything would be finalized soon, that my name had already been removed from certain documents, and that once the refinancing process was complete, there would be nothing left tying me to the property. And in that moment, I felt something inside me shift, not break, but harden. Because this was no longer about misunderstanding or generational differences. This was deliberate, calculated, and cold. And instead of reacting, I walked back to my room, closed the door gently, and sat at my desk, pulling out a folder I had not touched in years, one that contained copies of every document I had ever signed, every payment I had made, every legal agreement tied to that house. And as I flipped through those pages under the warm yellow light of my lamp, I realized something that Emily had clearly overlooked, something my son had either forgotten or chosen to ignore. My name was not just a formality on that house. It was a foundation, and removing it was not something that could be done quietly or easily without my full consent, and more importantly, without consequences. And for the first time since that painful dinner, I allowed myself to breathe deeply, because I understood now that I was not as powerless as they believed. And the next morning, instead of joining them for breakfast, I got dressed in my best coat, the one I wore to important meetings, and I left the house. Without saying a word, not out of defeat, but with a quiet, steady purpose, because if they thought I would simply disappear from my own life, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The air outside felt colder than I expected, even though the morning sun was already rising above the quiet suburban street. And as I walked down the driveway, I did not look back at the house, not because I did not care, but because I knew that everything I needed to reclaim was no longer inside those walls. It was in the truth I carried with me. And within 20 minutes, I was seated across from a man who had known me for more than 20 years, a lawyer who had helped my late husband and me draft the very documents that now stood at the center of this quiet betrayal. And when I placed the folder on his desk, his expression shifted from polite curiosity to deep concern as he carefully reviewed each page, and I watched him closely, not for reassurance, but for confirmation, because I already knew what I had heard, what I had seen, and what I felt. And after a long silence, he finally looked up at me and said something that settled my thoughts with a calm certainty. He told me that no one could legally remove my name from that property without my direct authorization, that any attempt to do so without my consent would not only fail, but could also expose serious legal consequences for those involved. And in that moment, I did not feel anger, I felt clarity, because what they had tried to do was not just unkind, it was reckless, and more importantly, it was reversible. And as we continued to speak, I made a decision that surprised even myself. I did not want to simply stop them. I wanted to let them continue just enough to reveal the full extent of their intentions, because sometimes the truth needs space to unfold before it can be fully seen. And my lawyer agreed to monitor any filings or changes related to the property, ensuring that nothing could be finalized without alerting me immediately. And as I left his office, I felt a quiet strength settle within me, the kind that does not need to be announced or displayed because it comes from knowing exactly where you stand. And that afternoon, when I returned home, I stepped inside as if nothing had changed, greeting them with the same gentle tone, sitting in the same chair, moving through the same routines, and they responded in kind, unaware that the balance had already shifted, unaware that I was no longer the woman they thought they could quietly remove. And as I watched Emily move through the kitchen, confidently making plans and speaking in hushed tones with my son, I allowed a small, almost invisible smile to form, not out of bitterness, but out of certainty, because for the first time since this began, I was no longer reacting to their actions. I was preparing for mine, and I knew that when the moment came, it would not be loud or dramatic. It would be precise, undeniable, and final. By the time the room settled into that strained, artificial silence, I had already made my decision, and unlike the younger version of myself who once tolerated disrespect in the name of keeping the family together, this time I was not going to explain, argue, or beg for understanding. I was going to let the truth unfold on its own terms, calmly and completely. So I reached into my handbag, the same worn leather bag I had carried for over 15 years, and placed a neatly organized folder on the table, sliding it gently toward the center where everyone could see it without raising my voice or shifting my posture. And I noticed the flicker of unease pass across Melissa's face before she quickly masked it with that practiced smile she used whenever she thought she could still control the narrative. But this was no longer her stage, and I no longer needed permission to speak in my own life. So I opened the folder and revealed copies of every document I had quietly gathered over the past 3 months, bank statements, property records, and most importantly the revised trust that I had finalized just 2 weeks prior. And I watched as my son leaned forward, confusion turning into something sharper as he recognized his own signature on papers he clearly had not read carefully. Because like so many times before, he had trusted her to handle things. And that trust was now sitting in plain sight for everyone to examine. I spoke slowly, clearly, making sure every word could be understood without effort, explaining that the house they believed would soon be entirely theirs had never been transferred the way Melissa had claimed, that the financial accounts she had been moving funds through had been flagged and corrected, and that every attempt to quietly push me aside had instead created a paper trail that protected me, not them. And I did not raise my voice when I said that I had chosen to restructure everything, that the home would be placed into a trust benefiting causes I believed in, and that any support I chose to give my family moving forward would be based on respect, not obligation, and certainly not manipulation. And for the first time that evening no one interrupted me, no one scoffed or rolled their eyes, because the weight of quiet preparation carries more authority than any argument ever could. Melissa's composure cracked just slightly as she tried to interject, suggesting there must be some misunderstanding, but I simply closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it, signaling that there was nothing left to debate. My son looked between us, the realization settling in layers, and I could see the moment he understood that this was not a misunderstanding. This was the consequence of choices, of neglect, of allowing someone else to rewrite the role I had in my own family. And as I stood up, smoothing the front of my coat with steady hands, I felt something I had not felt in years, not anger, not sadness, but clarity, the kind that comes when you finally stop asking to be valued and instead decide your value is no longer up for negotiation. And without another word, I turned toward the door, leaving behind not chaos, not confrontation, but a silence that would force them to sit with everything they had done and everything they had just lost. The cool evening air felt different as I stepped outside, not because the weather had changed, but because something inside me had finally settled into place. And as I walked toward my car parked just a few yards down the driveway, I did not rush, I did not look back, because for the first time in a long while I was not leaving in defeat, but in quiet control of my own life. And when I reached the driver's seat and closed the door, the silence inside that small space felt honest, not forced like the one I had just left behind. I rested my hands on the steering wheel for a moment, allowing myself to breathe fully, deeply, without interruption, without someone else's expectations pressing in on me. And it was in that stillness that I realized something important. I was not walking away from my family. I was walking away from the version of myself that had accepted being diminished in order to keep peace. And that version no longer had a place in the life I was building from this moment forward. The drive home was steady and unhurried. Each familiar street reminding me that the house waiting for me was still mine, not just legally but emotionally, because I had fought for it in the only way that truly matters, with patience, foresight, and dignity. And when I pulled into the driveway and stepped inside, the quiet did not feel empty, it felt earned. I set my handbag down on the kitchen counter and glanced around at the space I had spent years caring for, every detail holding memories that no document could erase. And instead of feeling sadness, I felt clarity, because now I understood that love without respect is not something to preserve. It is something to outgrow. Later that evening my phone began to ring, the screen lighting up with my son's name. And I let it ring, not out of spite, but because I knew that whatever he had to say now would come from a place of urgency rather than understanding. And I was no longer willing to respond to urgency, only to sincerity. A message followed shortly after, then another, each one longer than the last, but I did not open them right away. I made myself a cup of tea, sat down by the window, and allowed the quiet to remain uninterrupted just a little longer, because for years I had responded immediately, trying to fix, to smooth things over, to make myself smaller so others could feel comfortable, and that pattern had led me exactly to where I had been earlier that night, standing in a room where my worth was questioned, and I refused to return to that place, not even one step. When I finally picked up the phone and read his words, I noticed the shift, not in what he said at first, but in what he struggled to say. There were no easy excuses, no confident justifications, only fragments of realization beginning to form, and I understood then that this was not the end of something. It was the beginning of accountability, but whether that accountability would grow into something meaningful or fade back into old habits was no longer mine to manage, because I had already done the work I needed to do. I had already drawn the line that should have been there long ago. And now, whatever came next would have to meet me on the other side of that line, where respect is not requested but required.